Yeah, we can begin. Good. Sure.
Thank you, first of all, for finding time to speak with us.
I thank you for coming here such a long way.
It's quite exciting to travel to Cologne. We already briefly discussed what we would like to discuss. It's the first ever interview we organizing with the entire series, and we would like to use this mode of interviewing people who, in our view, either as theorists, curators, or artists, wrote history of last 20 years in our perspective. So the project Former West is inspired by the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we're beginning now in 2009, 20 years after 1989. And we're looking at two milestones, or perhaps only orientation points in our inquiry. 1989, when we're looking at the West as a victor, and looking at how that sentiment of a winner of ideological battle, if you will, quickly disappeared, and how in 2001 that changed entirely into being a vulnerable target. And then perhaps, I don't know, we're not quite sure about that, does autumn 2008 with the credit crisis provide us another orientation point or not in this entire debate? So perhaps what we would like to do with you is to, on one hand, test some of our starting points for the project and theoretical, conceptual issues we would want to look at, test in a way, do we want to go in the right direction? Do we want to use right methods? But of course, as one of those people who really theorize some of key issues of the developments in the art field after 1989, we would really want to have you close to articulate and shape that content together with us. So perhaps the first question to start with would go around this question around the year 1989. How do you see the changes that 1989 brought about? Is that at all some doubt? Is that at all a breaking point of a kind? And perhaps just walk us through your theories of the post-communist condition that you wrote about. So perhaps this year 1989, what significance do you assign to it?
Well, I think that there was no interest in the West, at least in broad public, for what happened in the East. It was very obvious when living in the West. Because one simply had a feeling, not maybe of the victory, but not. I wouldn't say people felt themselves victorious, at least people I experienced at that time. They rather had a feeling that Eastern Europe and also Russia ceased to be interesting in any way because they just gave up here in an alternative project, gave up everything that made them being interested for a long time. And so now there are simply people who have very long time ahead of them to accommodate to the Western way of life. It takes long time, maybe some decades, and then we see. Yeah, so it was a feeling that for foreseeable future, there can be no interesting things coming from the East because people just would be dealing with accommodating to the West and appropriating the Western culture. that was a relationship to the East. What was the relationship to the West? To inside the West itself? I think the problem is that we have, of course, this 20th century, which was a century of secular projects and secular utopias, and of different kinds: liberalism, communism, national socialism, fascism. All of them are secular ideologies and utopias, evolved out of some project of the 19th century. Some project of the 19th century, then realized in the 20th century, and then fundamentally abandoned. I would include liberalism also in this role, in this kind of paradigm. And then we are, in a certain way, we were transposed back into the 19th century. I would say that 21st century is a repetition of 19th century in many ways. First of all, free markets. Free markets and globalization. A project of 19th century reflected on by Marx in his International. That was actually an attempt of counter-globalization. He already started with the concept of globalization before he forwarded the idea of international as an answer to free markets. Then we have colonial wars. We have the problematic of control over the raw materials. We have emergence of mass media and press interested in celebrities. So the whole Princess Diana phenomenon, Beckham phenomenon, is already a phenomenon of the 19th century. We have pirates.
There you go, we do.
In 19th century. We have terrorists. We have great topics of corruption and financial crisis, one after another. Massive speculation because of free financial markets. And many, many other phenomena. And this return to 19th century was partially unconscious. In the West it was fundamentally unconscious. In the East it was conscious. Because people just wanted to go to the cultural paradigm before communism. The whole ideology of the Eastern Europe, Russia was revivalist. And what they could revival was 19th century fundamentally. So we have a revivalism in the East, and we have kind of sliding back in the West, and then coincide in the return of the 19th century. So it is 19th century minus socialist ideas.
Right.
Yeah. So 19th century was this old stuff that I described, plus perspective leading 19th century toward 20th century. Now we have repetition of the same without any perspective. And maybe the last point is religion. With religion, of course, if we compare structurally 20th century with 18th century and 19th century to 21st century, which I think is even inescapable in this context, then of course 19th century was a return to religion in a liberal sense, a kind of liberal form of religion after the terror of French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. So people were already at that time disappointed in the secular concepts and concepts of enlightenment, and all the thinkers of the West, be it in France itself, be it in Germany, be it in USA, be it in England, all of them tried to develop some kind of new religion after Enlightenment, which would be, which would do something good for the people, but without the excesses of revolutionary Enlightenment and phenomena like Napoleonic Wars and Japanese terror. Now, Hegel speaks about that, that people just were frightened. They were frightened and made a step back. He speaks of the phenomenology of spirits that they being confronted with, he speaks about mechanical death, like guillotine. The same actually vocabulary as now people speaking about Holocaust. People were frightened, scared, and being so frightened, then they just moved back. And though that's what happened also in the 20th century, after the end of the 20th century, of course. But now we have a completely different situation because we don't have concept of progress. That was very important for the 9th century. We don't have history as reference frame. We don't have any idea of promise, messianic promise and so on. So we don't have all these ideological components of 19th century. So we have returned of the religion, not to a liberal progressist form of religion, but to the radical conformist, radical conservative fundamentalist religion. And I think that Europe, which is under the immense pressure of political Islam at the moment, reacts to this by maybe one digression, which is important. One digression that if you look at the Cold War and communism, we can realize in many ways that it was not a real fight between liberalism and socialism, because they share too much values, also progress, ideal of consumption, ideal of democracy, socialist democracy or liberal democracy, ideal of justice, ideal of humanism, and many other ideals. So there was never a real confrontation. That's why Cold War was Cold War and never Hot War. And of course, if you look at Lenin's and Trotsky's writings at the beginning of the 10th century, you see that both of them envisaged the possibility of socialism being a regulative model of political structure under which capitalism would be developed in underdeveloped countries. So they made a revolution already under the presupposition of coexistence between political socialism and capitalist model of economic production. One can find in Lenin, for example, formulation like we have to create the possibilities for development of capitalism that Tsarist government can't create. So when I have this kind of coexistence, idea of coexistence from the beginning, and we have almost 90% of shared values, the only difference is that the West believed in immediate individual consumption, and socialism believed in delayed collective consumption. But it is maybe a difference, but it's not a real difference. So historically, it was actually nothing. It was nothing real. What we have now can be real, because this pressure from Islam, which is an effect of the post-communist condition, because during the Cold War, Islam was ally of the West in the anti-communist struggle. The whole Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Iran regime, also were all also Egypt and everywhere. There were so to say anti-communist alliance. This alliance was broken as an effect of the end of Cold War. And so this historical alliance began to be enemies, like as it's always happened in history. And then the West is under pressure of Islam. But the problem is that Islam is not a valuable alternative for the European populations. It's not like with communism. Communism was a real alternative. So people could imagine to live under socialism. And some of them wanted it, like in Spain, Greece, Italy, France, a massive communist alternative inside Western culture and so on. So it was a real possibility. Whatever you think about that, it's a good possibility, bad possibility, but it was a possibility. Islam is not a possibility. It's a possibility maybe for a minority in the West, but not for society as a whole. That means that the pressure from Islam has a different political, psychological, and cultural structure. And I think it actually ultimately leads to re-emergence of fundamentalist Christian movements inside the West itself. And this re-emergence, and I see that very, very clearly, leads to a break of the Western culture. Because this secular peace, the West, is a kind of post-Hobbesian institution. It's based on a secular peace between different religions, fundamentalism. It's a project of Hobbes that was a very effective project, and it's a project-based Western political cultural system. At the moment you get this fundamental way, the whole structure collapses. And you have the same formulations that we had with Tarleton, that only Catholic, ultimately, only Catholic Church is a religion, everything else is superstition, prejudice, and heresy, and so on and so on. So when this break already begins, so if you look, for example, at a relationship between Orthodox Christianity and Western Christianity, then it's obvious that they more and more regard themselves as enemies. Russia, Ukraine, Serbia, Belarus, Georgia are outside of the Western context, and Bulgaria and Romania and Greece have a very strange relationship to EU and actually not regarded as being part of the Western civilization. And if you speak now to the people in Baltic states, former Czechoslovakia, or Poland, or Hungary, it's very interesting that they never would say you anything about communism, fundamentally, we speak to the people there. For them, all this period of Cold War was an effect of Russian imperialism, and Russian imperialism was an effect of being subjected to a different civilization. Different civilization is an Orthodox civilization. So the word communism is no word now. Nobody speaks about that. And as a phenomenon of communist culture, communist party, communist ideology, it's just that it's not there. Yeah, people don't remember about it. They do remember about Russian imperialism and Russian domination of non-Orthodox countries of the West. That ceased, hopefully, peacefully, but maybe will be re-established if Russia will be more aggressive imperialism. Again, so we have now complete different confrontation. It's a religious one. The confrontation between communist and capitalist West is now reshaped, reinterpreted, recast as confrontation between Orthodox East and Western Christian world on both sides. Mm-hmm. On both sides. So if you're watching Russian TV, what I do, I do that on a regular basis. I'm watching Russian TV, and I'm also following Russian websites where all these ideological struggles are mostly take place. Then we have a very, very strong, absolutely new phenomenon from the Russian culture, because Russian culture was never like that. The now reawakening some radical thinkers of the 20th century, based in Prague, Eurasian movement, so-called Eurasian movement, so kind of Prague group, Russian immigrants there in Prague in the 20th century. They organized this Eurasian Union, and this Eurasian ideology begins to be...
And they were anti-communist.
They were anti-communist. And it, Jakobson was part of it, for example. Also Trubetskoy. And so they emerged now as a dominating ideology, increasingly, about Russian Orthodox, so Eastern European Orthodox humanity, that kind of is not Western oriented, but is original, completely different civilization. So they take this idea from Prague and Chile, of absolute difference between Western culture and Russian culture, between Islamic East and Catholic West. And the idea is to equidistance from them. So not to be allied to the West, not to go against the West, but to keep neutrality and to keep, so to say, sovereign, independent position. And in any case, not to be pro-West. And it's very interesting that also more and more people who governing, who kind of the leading figures of today's administration, Russian administration, going in this direction ideologically. And I think it's very interesting that, for example, a symbol of Russian presence in Latin America were two Orthodox churches built in Havana and in Caracas, in Venezuela, in a very short time. So suddenly they re-emerged in this alliance, but not as communist or socialist groups, but they opened huge new build and built very fast, like in a month, huge Orthodox churches in the center of Havana and in the center of Caracas. So that shows to what a degree contemporary Russian elite that is ideologically 100% Western educated, 100% Western educated, reappropriated the Western idea about Russia as a regional civilization has nothing to do with the West, and turned it against the West. So the West invented this idea as explanation why they want to exclude Russia, and the Russians reappropriated this idea as directed against the West, why we should not follow West, it should be in contradiction to this. So there is a very interesting correlation between Western attitude toward Russia as different from culture. And Russia that was always universalistic, always communist, always internationalist, and never nationalist, appropriates this completely Western idea that absolutely has no roots in Russian culture. But this small avant-garde group of these neo-Eurasians are extremely popular, extremely influential. They're everywhere, in TV, on the radio ways. They get all the prizes, for literature, for art, everything. So that's kind of new fashion, completely brought from the West. That's also Russian communism. And then directed against the West, that's also Russian communism. It's always a Russian way, to make some idea from the West and then turn it against it.
But you could also see that in relation to Islam, no? The same process of the identification of the Islamic, or fundamentalist Islamic religion really is orchestrated, particularly in Afghanistan, in reaction to the Russian invasion.
Not only as a Russian invasion, if you look at the whole history of Middle East, the radical politicized Islam was organized and actually structured by CIA, by Americans, everywhere, also in Iran. As Mossadegh government was eliminated, also in Lebanon, also in Egypt. If you speak to the people who were engaged, like people like Tariq Ali, so people who were engaged in communist or leftist movements, they can tell you how communist parties were suppressed. And actually radical Islam was used, politicized and used against it. The same thing was in a very spectacular manner in Indonesia. As leftist government had a chance to take power, I think more than 100,000 communists were slaughtered.
Sukarno at the end.
It was total carnage, and organized by the radical Islamic organization. So that was supported for the. So the political Islam is creation of the West. Also Taliban is creation of the West. Also Al-Qaeda was creation of the West.
Absolutely.
And not only as a response to the Soviet invasion. Soviet invasion was not an invasion, of course. Soviet invasion was a participation in a civil war, because government was already communist before Russian came. So it's from the Western front.
And remained for some years after the Russians left, actually.
It remained after the Russians. They have very strong communist party, very strong communist.
They call it democracy.
Yeah,
If you talk to Afghans about
and they
it.
completely secularize the country. So
Absolutely.
The freedom women and organized. They did all this reform. But then the West invented this Taliban, invented actually this radical political Islam as a tool against Afghan Communist Party in the first way, and then after that against Russians that tried to help them. And the point is that we have, so to say, this that is the effect of the Cold War, of course. But now what happens? Maybe my prediction concerning the West. I think the West, not only Russia West, but the West itself, I think will be divided against between Catholic and Protestant part. And I think it already starts because we have extremely important growing importance of evangelical movements in America. We have two evangelical presidents after another. I mean, Bush and Barack Obama have the same basis, this evangelical movement, against the same secular opposition, so McCain and Clinton. So the secular candidates lost in both cases, and evangelical candidates won in both cases. In this sense, there's no difference between Bush and Obama. It's the same in the countries, evangelicals. And then, on the other hand, you have growing Catholic conservatism in France, in Italy, in Germany. So, living in Germany, I very, very much feel it.
Wow.
And also in France, for example, Sarkozy already begins to speak about Catholic France. That would be impossible a couple of years ago. And for example, French coming to us, to Germany, are looking for Catholic values and Roman traditions and so on. So we have this kind of reawakening of old religious political lines of interpretation and conservative religion attitudes, and I think it's our future. It seems to me that's our future. So that's what 21st century will be for me. Because religion is a good way to articulate your desires. So if you don't believe in secular promises anymore, consumption,
Yeah, exactly.
and you can't believe in consumption after this financial crisis.
Yeah,
That's completely obvious. So you have to establish some kind of ascetic regimes with predominant spiritual values, and I think right and left coincide in being interested in that. Maybe for different reasons, but still.
And also the green movement, the ecological movement.
And the ecological movement is very much part of it.
Absolutely.
Very much part of it.
But
A precursor, in fact.
yes,
So we have it.
the new agencies.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's kind of, it's fascinating the way that you lay it out. But I want, what strikes me about the way that you lay it out, and I think I fundamentally agree with a lot of it, and particularly in relation to our project, is that what we want to look at is this question of the West itself and its reaction to these developments, which have to some extent happened to it. For instance, the collapse of communism. And it seems to me that you used a word at the beginning where you talked about the unconsciousness of the West to the changes that happened in '89 and the changes that happened also in relation to the growth of religion, and the unconsciousness of the West in stepping into the field that it now finds itself in. And that seems to me to be a crucial vacuum. That what you have is clear ideologies, outspoken ideologies of socialism and the desire of communism, of political Islam and the desire of religious redemption or whatever, of Christian fundamentalism and that desire. What happened in the West at some point, if we see the West as being defined by, or being defined in our terms by the Second World War, of course there are many Wests, and it goes back to the separation of the Christian Church between Rome and Constantinople at a certain point. But the West that we have to deal with in our daily lives is the West from 1945, defined. That's why Japan is part of the West at some point. The only reason it's included in the West is because of the Second World War, otherwise it would be absurd. So that Western world, for reasons that I find quite puzzling or interesting, seems to have been unable to articulate itself as an ideology. It always sought to naturalize its ideology. The free market, or its own ideology of freedom, was always a universal one. It's why Bush can even say that now that America contributes to human liberty, as he said with the last 8 years, he can still say that. But yet that notion of human liberty, or that ideology of liberty, that ideology of neoliberalism, or whatever, is never really an effective competitive ideology, which could then resist what's going on around it in an odd way. So even though it's extremely successful at one level, at the other level, at the heart of it, is the ideological heart. There's a vacuum of unspokenness, and I think it kind of distills itself into Fukuyama's idea of the end of history. That therefore we don't need to speak about this thing anymore. called ideology, called the imposition of a worldview onto the world, even if it doesn't match. And so what happens is that, or why the West maybe becomes the former West, is because without, as you described I think really clearly, a realistic competing ideology, it doesn't have anything to fall back on. And therefore religion is in a sense filling that vacuum. I mean, religion, the return of religion, or the restoration, if you like, because I think maybe we live in a time of restoration, which is the other question I'd like to ask, but let's stick with this vacuum of Western ideology. And the reaction to 89 was so passive in the West. It was a lack of recognition that this fundamentally changes the definition of what the West is. There was really no recognition of that, it seems. There was an unconsciousness of the challenge that the failure of real existing socialism represented for this unspoken ideology of the West. And that seems to be where the West becomes the former West at this moment, with the inability of the West after the fall of communism to be anything except what its enemies are not, except in negative distinction from what its enemies are. And it seems that a lot of the consequences in your predictions of religion or something stem from this. So I suppose my question is, or my discussion point is, why in its extreme successfulness was the West so unprepared to battle for a system of values or an ideology which could be put up against those other ideologies and project something forward of a future? It abandoned its idea of the future in that sense.
I think that what lies at the heart of any conflict is extreme similarity of fighting sides.
Yeah.
There's something like a negative mimesis. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be almost like your enemy to be a real enemy. Actually, in one of his essays, which is where he analyzing Carl Schmitt distinction between enemy and friend, Derrida says that there is one category which is very interesting. It's a category of brother. And brother is mostly enemy. So, and he speaks about ideas of French Revolution, which is equality, liberty, and brotherhood. So that is a recipe for radical animosity. Because it is only your brothers that you can really hate, and you can really fight. And I think that's problem. That's also because communism was such a brother, which was an enemy. As I said already, Western liberalism was almost indistinguishable from communism. There were very, very few and very minor distinctions, and that why they could actually fight each other. Now there is no communism, and Western is lost in the world with its ideology alone. Western is alone with secular liberalism as an ideological foundation of the Western system, and with the idea of human life as being the supreme value, liberal idea. So by politics, as Foucault described it, or Gama describes it, it is really ideological core of the West. Now it's quite obvious that if you are liberal and all your opponents, like national socialists and fascists and communists, are away, then you are in a very idiotic position, because everybody else around you is ready to sacrifice his or her life, and you are not. So you are completely incompatible with outside world, which is absolutely obvious in the moment as Bush began to, after the end of communism, to expand idea of Western democracy to Iraq and so on, it became immediately obvious that it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and the Americans asked why it worked in Eastern Europe, why it worked in Germany, why it worked in Japan, but it didn't work here. It is quite obvious because Japan, Germany, fascist Germany, Soviet Union was absolutely the same as the West. It was already the same social, political structure with some very minor differences. So you can change like that, and everything went its
Japan
different way.
too, you think?
Japan too, China too. It's the same structure. But if you go to Islam world, it is not. So it's not like you have the same paradigm and shift inside the same paradigm. You have a different paradigm. You have a different paradigm, which is central point is of course biopolitics. So it's a biopolitics of death. And not biopolitics of life. It's a biopolitics of death and immortality. So people don't understand that if you are struggling against somebody interested in immortality, and you are interested only in survival, then it's no real struggle. So the only possibility for Europe to begin take itself seriously with the West, take itself seriously, and to develop a new position in a new paradigm, is to re-emerge in terms of ideology, of faith, that allows the Western population to sacrifice itself. Because as long as you don't have it, you are not at different waves. You can't communicate. What is a fight? It's a kind of communication. War is a kind of communication. You can't communicate with the people. You can't kill them if they think something different as you think. You have fundamentally shared values. So, at the moment, Europe will be ready to sacrifice itself and its own population for some immortal ideas. Then they really can do it. Until they decide to do it. No, it takes not so many time. Like I would say, less than a decade.
Yeah, I think that's it. No, I see that as well. But it's what that represents, though, is a fundamental negation of the values of what we call the West and what we understand as the West.
Of course, yes.
So that eradicates the notion of the West from the field of ideological dispute.
You say that. You say that. But I live in Germany. Germany is interesting place, for intellectual discussions. And of course, you are speaking with the people who would say the West is simply territory of Roman Empire, of Roman influence, which was a Roman Empire, the pagan empire, and then the Christian Roman Empire. So that's the West, and a lot of specialists in cultural history, for example, von Braun, who's Christina von Braun, she argues that secularization and enlightenment, she argues like Hegel, is a purely Christian phenomenon, and was misunderstood by Europeans, but the West itself as being something, some kind of break with religion tradition, because enlightenment, as Hegel says, has so much presupposition about everything being organized according to logos or according to reason, and sort of concept of science, a sort of concept of truth, and all this stuff. It's heavily reliant on a certain kind of Christian traditions, as you don't have in different places. So she, for example, for her, the West is simply Roman Christian empire, yeah? And for many other too. Yeah? And enlightened civilization an episode. Yeah? If we understand the West in this way, then we have a completely different definition of the West. It seems to me that this other definition of the West becomes to be intellectually more and more attractive for the people.
So then, if we talk about the former West, we're talking about a particular moment of post-enlightenment, and in a sense, in a sense, a communist West.
I would absolutely see that. I would formulate it in the following way. I would say post-avant-garde West.
Yeah.
So we have a series of avant-garde movements in politics, and arts and sciences. All of them coincide. So all of them took place around 1999, 1910. So we have Futurist Manifesto, we have first major works major texts by Wittgenstein and Husserl, which constitutes the of common ground in the 20th century. We have first Black Square, first drawing for Black Square, and things like that. So we have all these fundamental moves between like 1909 and 1919, maybe these 10 years. Yeah, we have more or less everything. Yeah. We have and radical Marxism and all that. Yeah. So the Russian Revolution and rise of German nationalism, so we have everything. And Mussolini. So in these 10 years we have everything, then we got like 90 years, 100 years to think about that, and to reflect on that, or the fight for that, kill other people for that, whatever. And then it's over. So it's not a big deal. I mean, it's like a paradigm with some possibilities. Certain people embracing this or that possibilities and fighting each other, remaining in the same paradigm, then reflecting on that, and then being tired of it and confronted with new challenges.
But it is also a big deal, no? It's not
At the same time, it is.
and not only because that's what our generations have invested our energy in, but also because I mean, you've written about this, so it's only putting your words back in you. But the communist ideal, the utopia of communism, which is a result of this, is, I'm going to say it, it's still worth fighting for. In relationship to the other things.
Yeah,
yeah,
that can be, but you know.
No, in that sense, it's a big deal, no? Because what else have we got
to fight
apart from that? As we talk about, of course, we can have this pessimistic Jewish outlook on the world, which is probably legitimate, but at the same time, that also feeds. That's also the hope of those people that benefit from that loss of a future perspective, if you like.
Yes, of course, but you know,
we give up.
I look at that. Yeah, well, I look at that maybe a bit informed by my teaching experience. So, you know, I think it was a certain scene from the Evangelium as some, Pharisee, Sadducees, approaching Christ and said that he breaks with the law of prophets, our fathers. And then Christ says something very peculiar. He says, prophets had actually no children, so they were not our fathers. your fathers were the people that killed them. So the point is, and throw stone at them. So if you look at the children of our time, they are not children of this avant-garde, because the avant-garde has no children. Look at the students coming to me in art school. Look at the students of NYU. They never heard about all this stuff, before they entered NYU. They never heard of all this stuff because they entered any school or any university. There is some tradition of a religious education in the family. That, and it is still there. There's, for example, even a tradition of anthroposophic schools and anthroposophic kindergartens, and so on and so on. But there are no Marxist kindergartens, and there are no avant-gardist education of children in families. That means
the nearest
children
is Rudolf Steiner. It's true.
Yeah, children in a mess.
Yeah.
In a mess.
No, there aren't. Even in the micro, there aren't Marxists.
Yeah.
If there was, my son would be going to.
Yeah, well, but there are some Marxist families. For example, my family was Marxist family.
Yeah, mine too. But that's
Okay.
yeah.
There are some families which are Marxist family. Okay, and very well informed about all the struggles. Yeah, so as a child, I also knew about all the struggles. Yeah, because of that. But I tell you, it's a very small minority.
Yeah, for sure.
The absolute majority of the people,
For sure.
of the students, never heard about Picasso. They never heard about Andy Warhol. They never heard about Marinetti and so on and so on. They heard about certain rock bands, certain movies, and so on. So they have their background outside of this tradition. And if you go further into the population, you see less and less children that are informed as a childhood about avant-garde, be it political or artistic avant-garde. Now, when they come to the university, they start to study it. Sure. But they start to study it as a foreign culture, as a culture has nothing to do with their living experience during the 19 years of their education. Yeah? It's like they start to study Egyptian culture, whatever. It is something that is very interesting and stimulating, but it's not related to their living experience. So, be it a Jewish or not, I would say that Marxist avant-garde tradition, there is this tradition, of course, but its tradition is minoritaire. Yeah, it's a minority, and I think it would be not wrong to understand it. To understand that this tradition is a tradition of minorities, which is not bad, because we know these minorities, like Jewish minorities, survived through thousands of years. Yeah? Precisely, Jews know very well that it's maybe unpleasant, but it's not faithful to be a minority. Yeah? You can survive as a minority perfectly well, and from time to time, even contribute in a very substantial way to the life of majorities. But you are a minority, and I think the problem of many people here think that they belong to a dominating culture. They are a minority. If they would understand they are a minority, I think they would better deal with the situation. It's kind of unrealistic expectation and unrealistic appreciation of their own position. They think they are kind of mainstream, and they are not.
Yeah. But how does that relate to the say in the Netherlands, ubiquity of modernism. And does that still work as a description? And because the idea of modernism, which is different from avant-garde, I accept that, but nevertheless there's a relationship, certainly at certain points in its emergence. Or maybe not. I ask you that question: is there a relationship between modernism and the avant-garde? And then Western culture, the West, as we talk about it, has hitched itself, at least in its outward appearance. Often, if you think about the city, if you think about the ways that we relate also socially to that modernist ideal, the breakdown of family, things like this, is related not so much to avant-garde tradition, but more to an idea of modernity, of the modern, and an embrace of the modern. And that seems. And now the question is that, even within the societies that declare themselves modern, also a minority position, or do we try and make an active separation of modernism, certainly as an outward appearance, which is often what it's become to represent, concrete, square buildings, families breaking up, from avant-garde as a transformative social movement? How do they relate?
I think how the world actually looks like. Yeah, you don't look for certain intentions and projects and whatever that brought all this stuff into the world. Yeah, you don't think in this direction. What is culture for a certain generation? What they created as a cultural contribution for the next generation is nature. They are born into certain kind of surrounding. It is natural for them, and they don't ask about any projects that are connected to that. Some people do, but these people are this minority. And these people that are this minority live in a situation of self-deception, to a certain degree psychological, because they think that everybody else also living in the modernity is modern because of that. It's absolutely not the case. Like, for example, people thought about Soviet Union that because it's a Marxist country, people know something about Marx. But I never ever met in the Soviet Union anybody who ever read Marx. Yeah, of course. I read Marx, but because I had a lot of Western friends here, I could also do that. But Russians were completely, Soviets were completely disappointed about that.
You did?
We had Marxism and Leninism.
Yes, of course, because we are Western, and there was Western Germany, it was kind of ideological struggle. But Russians were completely out of it, yeah, and everybody had to give an answer to the question: what is primary, what's the secondary being or consciousness? Yeah? And nobody knew what was consciousness or maybe
so you couldn't really raise it.
So and then people just were dealing with everyday life. Yeah. And that's the point. I mean, this kind of minorities that's really interested in this project and so on has nothing to do with the bulk of the population that's just living in this surrounding, as it always lived in the surrounding, just trying to fit in it.
Whatever the surrounding is, in fact, whatever the given is.
If surrounding collapse, they begin to die without knowing why. Yeah? It's like a Russian population that is just dying out at the moment. Yeah, I know that. People just dying. And just dying without knowing why they're dying. They're dying why they Darwinian, on the base of Darwinian law, they just not, which is not the survival strongest, as it is always in all the time again incorrect translated, but it's about the fittest. They just don't fit, and so just die. But mostly the population fit. But if you fit in a certain system, It doesn't mean, and you can survive it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean as a body, as human body. It doesn't mean that you
Yeah.
have any idea about what this is the real. It's completely different areas of experience.
But then if we understand maybe not Marxism so much, but Leninism, then we understand the theory of the vanguard, not the avant-garde, but the vanguard.
Yeah.
And the vanguard being this minority, the Bolshevik, which I mean, of course, the rhetoric is about leading the people to communist consciousness and to realization, somehow to consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But if we discard that, then actually this minority, rather than being, at least in the ideology of the former West, for a moment, if we think about the West as a communist construction, then in that ideology, the vanguard is actually the driving force of social change. So therefore, the minority is actually the hegemony, is the group in power.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah,
and
I agree.
And that's what's.
I agree.
So therefore, has that changed? Is vanguardism now no longer valid? One question, and the second question is, that's related to it. And is that why the West becomes former? Because vanguardism is no longer.
Yeah, vanguard is no longer.
So that's a profound change. No, that this minority, which always was a minority,
I agree.
is no longer in power in a sense.
No, and
Because of democracy, or
no, not at all. Not at all.
Because of?
Not of democracy. Because at the moment you have ideological struggle, as it was struggle of Cold War.
yeah.
Then culture is seen as a field of struggle, as a kind of war theater. And if you have a war theater, then you have a line of command, as I like to say. And if you have a line of command, you have this vanguard that is in charge. Well, after the East collapsed, also these people in the West, there was a power. Bush government was last attempt for them to get the power back. Conservatives, and that's Trotskyist, in fact.
Former Trotskyists.
That's a former Trotskyist, But former Trotskyists tried to do that under the new disguise, but it didn't work out. So, because it's impossible. And what happened? At the moment, you don't have this kind of legitimation for the avant-garde. This avant-garde becomes to be what it is, namely minority, simply a minority. Simply a minority. And as simply a minority, completely negligible. So now, you look at who is popular and whatever. Look at what happens, if you, for example, if you are interested in some deep ideas about life, culture, future, and so on, who are asked? It's always football players. It's always Madonna or Britney Spears.
In the
that sense of life is love here, and I love you, and so on. And so, and if you ask why, because the opinion matters. The opinion matters. The opinion matters for the big public. I was once participating at a discussion by some bankers. It was in affluent times, to organize some kind of culture and at the same time social engaged foundation. And said, well, we need some TV personality, we need an actor, or maybe two, we need a sport hero, maybe two. And someone said, but you be very careful, no excuse to to invite a writer, an artist, or an intellectual, because it immediately makes the chances lower. Yeah, other people don't like them. So,
There you go.
at the moment, this minority begins to be not only
Yeah.
simply a minority, but unpleasant minority.
Unwanted minority.
Unwanted minority. And at the same time, what happens, for example,
Yeah.
you say East Germany. At the moment East Germany disappeared,
Yeah.
what you see is that whole investment of the German state in art virtually disappeared.
Yeah.
Museums were flourishing, the whole system was flourishing, everything foundation, everybody was happy. Why? Because art was an area in which you could demonstrate that you are anti-Nazi, because you show degenerate art, or you are anti-Soviet because you show abstraction, and so on and so on. So it was okay. After collapse of the in Germany, everything disappeared as never was. Yeah? And even in feuilletons, there is no now in German feuilletons, there is no now section art, the Kunst, but art market, Kunstmarkt.
Yeah.
Really? Oh.
Yeah. So it's just as was never there. Yeah. So what happened is that at the moment of when the ideological warfare or cultural warfare stops, you don't need the vanguard anymore. This vanguard loses its command position in society and its influence on the structure of the society, and begins to be, as I said, simply a minority.
Yeah.
A change in a cultural political psychology of this minority is very painful. It seems to me. It's very painful, but it is so. The only possibility is like our friend Terry Gibson to change the position and to switch from Marxist position to Catholic position, using the same formula of coincidence of the face and the reason. Yeah, so actually, Marxism also based in this kind of silence, being combination, rational at the same time, messianic. So it based actually on Rhenish Catholicism, as a Catholic, from here, from Trier.
I missed the lecture. You wanna?
I know, I missed it.
You wanna connect to your ideas of restoration, actually, just not to lose that connection.
And also an art maybe, but I have to go to the Louvre. And I just thought one thing it's more a filling in of what you say, because it makes it clear to me that what you see in the populist right, for instance, since '89, is the attack on elite. And what was a vanguard becomes an elite.
No.
Experts, you know,
it's formulation of the new elite.
Yeah.
A new elite.
Yeah.
A new elite is based on a completely different idea.
Yeah. But the old elite is attacked, or the old vanguard is attacked by the populist right. As, for instance, I remember I used to live in Copenhagen, and a lot of the discussion of the populist right in Copenhagen, not only the in a way the new National Socialist and Freedom Party, but also the populist right, was against the experts who determined Danish society. And this attack on the experts, I think, is a way. I mean, it's as it fills in your argument, it's a way of shifting the vanguard to a minority. This was a mechanism that was done.
100%. But I would say is a shift of power from legitimation of power based on argument, so based on theory,
Yeah.
To populist, in a sense of representative, real, like a democratic representation of a population as it is.
Yeah.
Because elite want always to educate people, to change them. So they always represented something like a new man, a better man, a better future. And we have the elites that represent people as they are. And that's why
The
I
new elite.
always tell my students as they come to me
Yeah.
that if you are sitting in my lessons, you have to realize two things. First, with every lesson, you're 2 hours nearer to your death. And that's very important, because it's about time. And then, you're more and more far away from any possibility to make money as a society, to make any career. Because if you are stigmatized by knowledge, you begin to be non-representative.
yeah.
And if you begin to be non-representative, you have no chance. For example, if you are a rap singer, only a good rap singer, if you even don't cannot read the notes, the music, you have to have no education at all. Then you get millions and millions, and you are part of the elite, because you are representative of the majority. If you have any knowledge at all, you are already stigmatized, and you are already non-representative. So you have not away from elite to non-elite. So you have a change of elites from educational elites, which are the avant-gardes, to representative elites.
Because Obama is a question. How does he fit into that?
Do you know where it is?
No.
The toilet is at the end of the
Right, yeah.
at the floor. It was the right direction. End of the floor.
I guess I would like to, when Charles returns, just ask the question about how this return to the 19th century structures translate into development in art. Huh?
Yeah, sure.
That's a struggle. Susanna, you need your water.
Yeah.
You thirsty somewhere there. You, the camera's still running.
Yeah, I just keep it
So
on.
I can also go.
Yeah.
Take turn. Can we stay for a couple of days?
Hmm?
Can we stay for a couple of days?
No.
Speak with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I am ready.
Perfect, yes.
I am ready.
Gonna try one of these lovely cookies. They look very beautiful.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
No, it's all right. Good. This is great. Yeah, we should do Obama and restoration maybe. And then we have to do art. that's the big one.
do you want also cookies? Yes, this kind. What
Yes.
is it?
Would be nice.
I think we have to open that.
It's a
Yeah,
nice
it's an
room.
interesting project. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it would be good at some point to talk a little bit about how we progress it as well. I mean,
It's about practical science.
Yeah,
of course.
exactly.
Because I'm going to America at the end of January
Yeah.
for 3 months.
So then you know all about Obama by then.
Yeah, it's really exciting thing. So, if there is something to discuss practically,
Yeah.
what we need to do now.
I mean, obviously it's a fairly long-term project, this, because we're thinking of and we want to open it in the spring of 2012,
Mhm.
which is in cultural terms, of course, a particular moment.
I asked Boris, could we stay for a couple of days, and he's fine.
Yeah, sure.
So, in a way, it might feel like returning to the very beginning, but I'd like to look at how this return to the 19th century plays out in art. Huh? What does it mean for art?
I think for art, it means that art again begins to be interested in the audience, in people. There are many wants to be political. Art in the 9th century was political. Wants to take its audience seriously and do something for this audience, be liked by the audience, and cares about outside world. And in the deep sense of the world, art of today, the contemporary art, is realistic, as it was art of the 9th century. So what actually happens, that art is mimesis of reality, and tries to describe life as it is, social conditions, political events, intellectual trends. So it actually fulfills the traditional goals of the art of the 9th century. So representation of a mimesis of reality plus intervention into reality from a certain kind of ideological political standpoint, advertising certain ideas. Which is of course quite a change with avant-garde that tried to develop, not try, but despised the audience. Wanted to be completely independent, to build their own reality, and to create a position from which it could teach people, educate people, and change the world. But to change the world, you have to find something that is completely independent from the world. You have to find a position outside of the world. And that's what avant-garde tried to do, and that's what contemporary art absolutely doesn't want to do. It's not cool. So I think that contemporary art is fundamentally a return to the art paradigms in the 9th century too.
But what the distinction that you made between the 19th century and now is that the 19th century had a horizon, which was revolutionary change, whether that was nationalist or communist, and we don't. So therefore, what I think even in the 19th century, I mean, you're right. You know, if you think about symbolism or social realism or pre-Raphaelites or whatever, it's absolutely that description. But there was also in the 19th century some ideological positions taken. I'm thinking about Courbet and the Paris Commune, the collaboration is the wrong word, the cooperation between artists and say, early workers' movements, the design, William Morris, design, these moments were also 19th century moments, which were also about realism, absolutely, but they were about realism in the service of some horizon.
I think to a certain degree...
Do we have that?
Yeah, to a certain degree, yes, I would say so. Yeah, I would say there is a kind of... I would say there is a kind of social concern, political concern, in terms of not politics but morals, I would say. That is also very much 9th century. So people don't want to engage, as it was maybe earlier. They do want to do something good. Something good for community, for themselves, for their friends. Actually, we're living a very nice time in Europe and America. Yeah? But most people in the art world don't share for many years a fundamental idea that art should be evil, or is evil per se. And people don't believe it. They think that art is something good and has to do some good things, for itself or society. As an example, maybe it's a radical example, but it's really a paradigmatic example. At one of the entrance exam in our school, I saw a young girl from Hong Kong. She wanted to be student in our school, and asked her what she knows about German art. And she said she didn't know a lot about German art, but there's one artist that she liked very much. So who's Joseph Boris. So why? And because he planted a lot of trees in Kassel. And Hong Kong really needs such an artist because it's a terrible lack of green.
So you leave the stones aside, just the trees.
Yeah. So the point is art is understood as something good. And you know, in this sense, maybe I would contradict myself, but in fact not. I think that secularization of end of religion, end of religion, moves to some kind of secularization of art, as we see in avant-garde. So, what happened? Religion for a very long time, the central matter was to save your soul. Yeah, it's a very egoistic attitude. Religion was about saving your soul. At a certain point in time, as people didn't believe anymore in their soul, then began to be humanistic. So religion was about doing something good, like community, society. And at the same time, the same happens now with art. So people just don't believe in art. They don't believe that art can save their souls. Of course, avant-gardists believe that. No question about that. And interesting, I still saw in my life in the Soviet Union people who believed that. So I don't know. I do know what I speak about. There were really artists and poets who really believed that art and poetry will save the soul. And what's more interesting, it's really saved in many ways. So, now I don't see that. Artists don't think that art is something that is there to save their souls. So they think that art is something to make a career, and money, and attract attention, or to do something good. That is, so to be immoral, but in a very kind of pragmatic sense, to be pragmatic, or to be a good person.
And that's also where immortality comes in, no? Because the method of saving the soul is in the immortal muse, in a sense, in the museum.
In the museum, but immortality, we have some kind of crisis of immortality, and I don't believe that it takes a long time to find a good place for immortality, because also we have a crisis of immortality.
But I think the old artists, the idea of saving the soul through art is about this idea of immortality through...
Absolutely.
That there's not... It seems it would be difficult now to find an artist who says, I struggle and suffer in my garret, in the classic notion of the suffering artist of the 19th century, to some extent 20th century, in order to save my immortal reputation, perhaps, maybe not soul, but
soul,
name.
Simply soul.
Soul.
Yeah, absolutely, simply soul. It's not about reputation. Look, we can move in different directions.
Yeah.
But what is interesting for me in all this context, in that if you look at Soviet Union, if you look at Nazi Germany, if you look at American liberal system and so on and so on, then you see secular ideologies that didn't believe in immortality, but the satisfaction of human needs on earth. And that is completely unrealizable. And unrealizable, first of all, you can't put human life as a supreme value because everybody is mortal. So it's completely paradoxical and manipulative. And then you can't, and you shouldn't want to satisfy desire because desire is unsatisfiable by definition. So the whole system of ideologies, I mean all of them together, be it fascism, be it National Socialism, be it liberalism, be it communism, are based on some kind of huge misunderstanding about the nature of death and about the nature of desire. And of course there's enough people like from Bataille to that, Lacan, the others, Kojève, whoever, who analyzed that during the 10th century and saw that it's a huge mistake. Now, if you look at art in this time, art was only one place of immortality where the concept of immortality was not given up.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say that artistic avant-garde cooperated with other avant-garde movements, but I see fundamental break between them. Yeah? Cooperation is what I described in Example of Stalin. Yeah? But at the same time, we should not overlook the fact that at a certain point in time, all of the artists broke this communist idea, and broke because of that. Yeah? Because of the question, what is about individual immortality? And at a certain point in time, they saw the contradiction between social project and personal immortality. For example, if you look at Malevich writings of the 30s, there's everything about that. And I almost would say that even in the 60s, these people like John Cage and others, and also, of course, Andy Warhol, which is a paradigm of the striving for immortality. We have this immortality, desire of immortality, very strong about. It seems to me that as secular ideology is declining, also in a very paradoxical way, but understandable way, also art less and less is dominated by the striving for immortality, the desire, the quest for immortality. And more a quest for success, for the present. I don't know what happens after all, but I think that art maybe finds a new way, maybe a new, all this lettres du sacré, all this interest for religion, has, I think also for art, opens a chance to engage the thinking of art again in different ways. It was
thinking of immortality.
Again, to engage it again. Engage in different way it was during the 20th century. Because I think that art is structurally, the question of immortality is structurally unescapable for art, simply because of the fact that art survives society. The precondition of artistic activity is that art product survives the condition of its production. So if we, for example, say that with people like October people and so on and so on, that art has to reflect on condition of its production and distribution, I completely agree. But we should not forget that this kind of survival
Yeah.
is also one of the structural elements of art.
Absolutely.
It is just there.
Yeah.
So it is not possible, it's simply impossible not to think about that. People don't do that now mostly. But it's structural deficit of contemporary thinking about art. So we
You
have
have to
to
think about
we have to care. Because it is so.
Yeah.
We have to reflect on that. And we have to care about that.
Yeah.
It's unescapable.
Yeah.
And if you care about that, you care about immortality.
Mhm.
Not because you believe in something, but because you know something. You know that you're doing something for immortality.
Yeah.
Yeah?
And you could prove it by going to the museum and seeing
Of course.
that you join that immortal.
Of course, you go
In
to
some way.
the museum, you join that model, and what you also see is that all these objects that are there survive not only the creator, whatever,
Yeah.
there was a whole cultural context
Absolutely.
in
Absolutely.
which they were produced.
And they're completely remade in a new cultural
Completely,
context.
completely. So the artwork should reflect also that.
Yeah.
And that was precisely the argument of Malevich. He says that his black square can be recontextualized in any circumstance because it's a transcendental form of a possible image.
Yeah.
And also Kandinsky, finding Kandinsky is spiritual art. Yes? He says that actually every possible painting is my painting because every possible painting is a combination of form and color,
Yeah.
whatever it is otherwise.
Yeah.
So all of them try to reflect kind of post-mortal or immortal condition of their own practice. In a very strange way, contemporary art doesn't do that.
No.
And I see that as a structural deficit. It's just not reflective enough. It's not because they don't believe it or whatever. It's just they kind of don't look at one important dimension.
But they also, but also, it is not the lack of ideological of an ideological horizon, which happens after '89. The reason that can no longer there's a relationship, it seems to me, with the end of the immortal as an aspiration, or maybe not as an aspiration, but as a possibility in contemporary art, and the end of an ideological horizon. Yeah? So when we compare with the 19th century, for instance, this absence of the ideological horizon, which is the difference.
Yeah.
If we think about the restoration of a 19th century system, without communism, in a sense,
Yeah.
call it
Without communist promise.
yeah, without the communist promise, exactly, is then also means it's without immortality in the artistic field.
Yeah,
Because it's without that horizon of...
without that horizon, because the problem is, of course, that we have also in philosophy, like Deleuze, this is not accidental, Deleuze is so popular now. So we have kind of philosophy of change, permanent flow.
Yeah.
Neo-Heraclite, what is actually Neo-Heraclite attitude. Also actually pro-war attitude as Heracliteans. And that means we have a complete, also as a reflection of complete lack of this horizon, of this perspective, that would give to art something like a possibility to think the time after the time, the future beyond future, as Derrida said. This possibility is, that was a communist possibility, of course. Communist possibility was possibility of future beyond future. But art is, as he is now, not able to do so, and so I completely agree. So the people, I just think, okay, I will be famous for 15 minutes, and then I forget about that. And the quote, Andy Warhol, somebody who was interested only in immortality, and he said this about 15 minutes. It's completely ironic. It's what he wanted to avoid. In fact. But they think, okay, that's our horizon, 15 minutes, he said it, yeah.
Yeah.
And also we operated in 15 minutes. Yeah. It's very strange. Yeah. So it's true.
There was somebody from a Dutch artist from the 80s generation, so before 89, very much, Nick Kemp actually, who was completely forgotten and irrelevant to the discussion now because he didn't change. But he said something telling in I suppose it was the mid-90s or so. He said there's a really difference between my generation. They always thought in generations, those artists. And somehow or the Dutch think in generations maybe, I don't know. But my generation and the current generation, the young generation, which was my generation then. And he said that we were the no generation, but now is the yes generation.
Yes, man.
But this is the implication that there was somehow a reason, which was for the sake of art, yeah, that you would say no. But then after 89, the reason for that immortal sake of art is gone. So therefore, there's no reason to say no. There's actually no basis on which you would to say no would just be, either arrogant or unpleasant or awkward, but there would be no other reason to say no. And I think artists became yes men, not in the contemporary sense, but in the older sense. Yes men because they had no reason to say no. There was no longer a reason to resist.
Yeah, okay, because there is no distance. So if you, I think the problem is that there's some kind of misunderstanding. Yeah? As the people saying, we are against the system, we are against, we're against the system, we're against the order. Yeah? So we are revolutionary. Yeah? Which is absolutely absurd because there is no order and there is no system.
It is, yeah. Which system?
Which system of order?
Well, the system is everything. The system
it's not. It's,
yeah.
Because official ideology is ideology of change. Yeah? Change we can. Yeah? So the only thing is a change.
Right.
And so who we? Power.
Yeah.
Power can change. Yeah? And change. So we can. So then we have the situational flow of time and flow of change. And people are going with the flow. And that is precisely what already in 30s was described as a kind of new modernist conformism. Yeah?
A sort of vitalism, no?
Yeah, vitalism and conformism. Like Shklovsky said, as he changed from his opposition position to Stalinist, he was asked why, and he said, time is always right. And also Heidegger, the idea of being in time, time and Wahrheit, time and truth, it says truth itself is historical and changing by time. So if you want to
which
be,
was convenient
to
for
be
him.
truth, you're just following time, and everything will be okay. So we have these ideologies of new conformism, and I would say that this ideology became absolutely dominant. People just want to flow with time. Everybody, like in the Soviet Union, I would say the West became like a Soviet Union. Like a Soviet Union, every day in the morning, you ask yourself, before take your tea, a coffee, you ask yourself, what is up to date today? Not to make a mistake, to quote a wrong name or interpretation. And after you have established that, you make the next step, like drink your coffee. and that is contemporary West. Every so-called intellectual artist, waking up in the morning, ask yourself, what is fashionable today?
Which thinker?
What is up to date? What I should do today? Not to miss the point. And so it's completely identified with time, and there is no perspective of eternity, and no concept of immortality. So no distance to time, no distance to change, no distance to movement. Everything is le mouvement. And so no point of resistance. And I completely agree that with you that the possibility of criticism It's a mortality. If you are not immortal, how you can criticize anything? That you are a bad character, unpleasant character. That's all. And of course today you can't criticize anybody. You can't criticize. Teaching Kant to my students or Hegel, and say something about them, something critical. Students are absolutely devastated, because they think, well, they wrote a lot of books, they really invested a lot of energy in that, and so some guy comes and says it's not true. How can it be? It's somehow unpleasant, unkind, and shows kind of lack of real humanity and understanding. That's it.
And I also remember that, in trying to capture them, the 90s, which is in a way what this project will try and do, I think, that there are interesting phenomena at times. One for certain is relational aesthetics, which we should talk about in a little bit. But I also remember this sense, and Obrist in a way defined it, of the energy, this sort of vitalism of particular spots. So what he did, for instance, was to declare, I think the first thing was a Scandinavian Miracle. It was interesting that he uses the religious term as well. And then there was a guy, I was living in Glasgow when the Glasgow Miracle, when Hans Ulrich descended and told us that we were subject of a miracle. But that miracle was often, problems of power and pragmatism that he uses there, which are irrelevant. But what's interesting is that he's searching for, and I think still to some extent he is, searching for this idea of energy. So this idea of ultimate presence, because I think energy is ultimate presence. It's like you're absolutely in the moment. You're in the moment of the creation of this thing which is probably going to evaporate, because energy does. You expend energy. So it will evaporate at any moment. And the attempt is to move and to identify these points of flow. And I think that was very much the art world of the 90s, at least politically, but I think also the artists fitted into that, of trying to tap into that energy, but it's to some extent trying to create it. I think in Glasgow in the 90s, when certainly I, but I think all of us were much less theoretically sharp, but we had a sort of instinct for, maybe we can try and do something here. It was, how do we make this place energetic enough that people will take notice of us? How do we get noticed? What do we have to do to do it? Do we, we have to make certain art. So you have Douglas Gordon or Christine Paul, and not so famous now, Jonathan Monk or whatever. Or how do we get the institution noticed? You have to do this and this. And it was all a very sort of pragmatic plan, I think, that the 90s introduced, because we had no other horizon to look forward to. And I think that when we come to make the exhibition, I think we have to take into account in the 90s this question of energy. And the theory that you provide, in a sense, to explain it.
Yes, absolutely. And the concept of energy has a quite clear origin. It's Nietzsche thinking, and so Nietzsche thinking, and then, of course, Bergson.
Which is one of the people we were reading at that time.
Yeah, and all those people.
That's right.
You have all these people.
And memory in relation to that.
And then Deleuze, of course, very much so Deleuze. So you have this kind of this line, which is very strong, of course, and can be combined also, of course, with Marxism, because of this kind of material side of his theory and materialistic energies in that. But the problem is that I think you are confronted with two problems in that. One problem is that if you speak about energy, you go in the same direction as this rap singer, because every time you begin to think or do something, you lose this energy. So you have to escape thinking, you have to escape doing, labor of any kind. You should not stop but only circulate, all the time. But now you have this idea of body without organs, and you have also this concept of infinite desire, infinite energy. But I must say, I'm very skeptical about that. First of all, because I feel my organs from time to time. Then, I feel from time to time complete lack of desire. Yeah, I was just exhausted, tired. Yeah, I want to go sleep. And also because it's energy. Maybe I'm trained to Marxist or whatever. Yeah. But I spoke to Derrida about that and some other people, and I just don't get it here completely. Yeah? You know, all this delusion, and Derrida also is part of it. Yeah? And it's really serious. A lot of governments that try to make is about immaterial worker, like Negri, or Vilnas, is post-Fordist, the material, and whatever. And I want to ask a simple materialist question, what is the bearer of that? What is the hardware? It's everything about software. If you speak about, for example, virtual space or whatever, that was very popular at that time. Yeah? After all, you have so many, it's actually a telephone. It's telephone with cables, with this equipment. You're paying money for that. You have you have telephone companies. I don't think what is virtual in it, what is immaterial in it, and what is infinite in it. I somehow just didn't get the point. For example, if you have an infinite, I'd ask Derrida, it's really interesting. If you have an infinite work of deconstruction, infinite delays also, but he only produced so many books here, because there's so many papers in the world. Yeah, even if he has written very very fast, in the world, but even you read on all the papers in the world, on all the computers in the world, it's still limited investment of time and space. Yeah, it's not infinite. This whole idea of infinite energy, infinite networking, infinite flows of information and whatever, I never could understand that. I tell you, it's not a joke. It's real. It's real life I live it. I was sitting in a conversation with a guy who was director of kind of provincial Kunsthalle here in Germany, and I asked him just for the goals of conversation, what kind of art you exhibit? He said, well, I also show material art, and I never show immaterial art. Well, why do you show immaterial? Because immaterial art is too heavy and too expensive. That's what that is a country. And it's really a good answer to all the theories. Yeah, it's okay, but it's too heavy and too expensive.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. I remember doing a show in the Glasgow days, which was called Utopia. Yeah, and the V was sort of virtual, and it was a nightmare because we couldn't install it because all the cables weren't connected. It was all about physical problems completely. We had this spectrum of virtuality, and everybody was going around plugging things in and switching them on, and they didn't work.
They didn't work.
No, they didn't work. No. We opened in the end, but everything was a bit like
shaking,
stuck together with bits of tape and.
It's everything. The whole theory is about software, soft power. It's not about hardware or hard power. Yeah? And I never could understand that.
But I think maybe we should also in this notion of softness. One definition of that 90s might usefully be energy somehow, and I think it also relates maybe to some of the virtual artworks, which we should also think about for this project. But the other thing that we have to tackle, I think, is relational aesthetics in some way. And how does this fit into our beginning? Now we're starting to start a narrative. Yeah? The narrative of the lack of horizon, the loss of a promise for a future, which the 90s represents, the loss of ideological tools, in a sense, to understand the world. And you can't do this application anymore of ideology onto
the real existing world in order to understand it. Somehow we lost it. So relational aesthetics grows as a set of I suppose it relates to what you said earlier about that art still wants to do good somehow. It still has a moral ambition, maybe, to do good. But without this promise, it has to do good in the here and now. Somehow, it can't say, I'm doing this because later it will be revealed to change the world, but I have to try and change the world in the here and now. And I wonder whether relational aesthetics relates to that ambition. That it's... Is it... okay, I'm sorry, I'm being a bit incoherent, but I used to think that relational aesthetics developed because it relates, I suppose, to what Margaret Thatcher said at one point, which is there is no such thing as society. There was an ideology which came from the right, which was to deny society and to deny the idea of the collective. It was an ideological battle at that time, it was before '89. And that somehow, at least maybe in Britain, but I think also in other societies, was to some extent taken over after '89. That this was the end of the collective, and therefore the end of a certain possibility of the social, of being together. That we were now individual consumers. That there was niche marketing came in. The idea that we would satisfy your desire, and your desire was different from your desire, and that the system's job was to make you happy and you happy, but not be happy together. Really, but you happy apart. And so relational aesthetics, I used to think, came in as a compensation for that. In other words, as a way of trying to say, no, there is a society, and if we can't take it for granted, we have to prove it. We have to say, there is a society, and look, there are these people eating the same Thai green curry that was made by an artist, and these people eating the same Thai green curry are a society. So therefore, look, Mrs. Thatcher, here is your society, it exists. Yeah? We're not a family, we're not related by blood, we're not related by ethnicity, we're a society. Yeah?
So art making up for the
Yeah.
society.
And I used to think about that quite, and this isn't how Boris describes it, it's a different description, but for me it related to this in my sort of political understanding of how it was doing. But now I wonder if it's more about simply a demonstration or in our discussion now, whether it's a demonstration of this here and nowness, which becomes important. That you're the kind of statement of the 15 minutes in a way. Yeah, that we're here and you're here, and somehow in this kind of exclusive moment where you're eating food together with this artist who's got the 15 minutes of fame already assured, that you sort of share in it. It becomes part of a sharing of a celebrity-ness, or a sharing of feeling for a moment elevated to in the here and now to some other position. And now I'm struggling to work out what relational aesthetics is. It could of course be both. It's possible, but I wonder whether. My question would be, how do you see relational aesthetics, or do you see relational aesthetics as a significant development in the 1990s?
Yeah, perhaps to add to it, I wonder whether we're looking at relational aesthetic because it's one of very few coherent theoretical concepts about the 1990s. Because we actually also believe that something like that codified that decade, and I'm not quite sure. When you look at Eastern Europe, for example, at that period, more towards the 1990s, after we've read Relational Aesthetics and seen Traffic exhibition of Borio. But I wonder, there are very few coherent theoretical concepts comparable to this.
No, I agree.
Whether there's any other way to look at the 1990s or not. And a question, how does 2001 actually play to everything what we've said about the return to the 19th century in some ways? Does 2001 bring any nuancing into the whole story?
Is it relevant enough?
Is it relevant enough, right? As a milestone, as a moment that changes some sort of paradigm or not?
Well, I think that maybe a big change was the beginning of perspective to come back. So, just to ask, by asking the question, how we produce value in general. Yeah? So, the traditional way to produce value and to understand the value production is a work, yeah, so the Marxist idea. It's also ideas that you find actually in Greenberg and in other Marxist theoreticians. So artists produce something and create value through production. And then, on the other hand, you have Duchamp, which is value creation by changing things, yeah, from moving things from one place to another. It's operational capital, and specifically financial capital. Yeah, so moving from toilet to the museum space. It's like moving rice from China to Britain. So moving things, and by moving things, you add to them. So I think relational aesthetic is, among many other things, is codification of that.
Right.
So the understanding of value production as financial capitalist operation, and not Marxist understanding of value production as a labor operation by labor. Now, being a classical Marxist, to a certain degree, I would try to subject this to a Marxist analysis. Namely, if you have, for example, a toilet, and you have the museum, okay, and you bring the object from toilet to the museum, how the value is actually produced? I would say, in Marxist terms, that the value is produced by the labor of the people who built the museum. So what happens here is a private appropriation of symbolic value created by the work of other people, which is specific also for France, yeah, with its state apparatus and many others. So, if you look at the relational aesthetic, I would say it is an artistic counterpart of financial system. So I would understand in analogy to yuppie movement in the US side. So this kind of stockbroker culture, yeah, that appeared in the same time, to deal with symbolic art value in the same way, and to understand the function and production of the same values in the same way as it was understood through stock exchange, yeah, by stockbrokers at the same time. And you immediately see that at the same time, same mentality, the same parallel. I think if you...
It's related to exchange, no?
Through the exchange, the value production through exchange. And they invest in spaces that actually were produced built. But if you begin to expand the system on, let's say, unbuilt places, and we say exhibition can be everywhere, yeah, then it has a financial collapse.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have financial collapse of the symbolic value. If you put that in Guggenheim Museum, if you did that now, if you put that in Louvre, if you put that Tate Modern, it's okay. Why? Because a lot of social investment, economical investment of labor already happened. If you just say that is a place, yeah, every possible place where that can take place, then you begin to use speculative capital.
To try to generate this place.
I think that, so you gentrify this place. Yeah, and by gentrifying this place, you kind of spend your symbolic capital, so you lose it. So I think the problem with relational aesthetic is that its expansion is limited.
Mhm.
Yeah, because it is good for the network of already built institutions,
Yeah.
where the investment is already done.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, if you begin,
Yeah.
and what happened then is that began like American financial capital.
Yeah.
He began to invest in the things that are not built,
Yeah.
and then they lost money. And so I think that relative decline of relative aesthetics that we can watch now has to do with this disregard for the hardware
Yeah.
and invested labor.
And also the,
Hard realities of life.
and the relational aesthetic, or the value of relational aesthetics work depends on that pre-investment.
Yes.
In other words, it is
a derivative.
Using up. Yeah.
It's derivative.
Yeah. And in exactly in the sense of a financial derivative.
It's a derivative.
And at the point where that original investment is used up,
Yeah.
then the thing collapses. It also strikes me that the whole idea of the infinite that we're talking about as well has a lot to do with this idea that the idea of speculating about the infinite, which was the theory of virtuality or a body without organs or whatever, also was taken up by the financial services industry. You know that their investment in the infinite expansion of capitalism.
And
Basically
free flow of capital.
Yeah.
It's absolutely delusion.
Yeah.
The contemporary capitalism, as a pre-crisis capitalism, is a delusion,
Yeah.
completely delusion. But also, I think, go back to the immortality, I think the problem with value, and value, I think, is something that you should not disregard. Being a capital has to do with certain kind, and is to certain kind of expectation of immortality, so kind of stability. The value is actually, in our culture, is not something that is produced in a past. Uh-huh.
Need to help with something? We're writing. Do we need to finish writing? It took for 2 hours and 15 minutes.
Gosh, I'd quite like to do the 2008, where we are now, thing. Should we not try and...
In 2001.
2001, yeah. The problem is I really in this conversation, and I think increasingly 2001 is just a symptom.
Then let's ask it.
It's not a moment in which anything significant changed. It's just a symptom of the changes that had already happened and continue to happen.
But then 2008.
And then is that a symptom, or is that a
Or is that a
cause?
real one? Susanna, would you want to use this occasion and grab a cookie?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
Or a small Japanese nut.
Go for it.
What do you do with that?
Okay.
Boris, do we need to...
No problem at all. Yeah, no,
Sure.
Natalia wanted just to take a breath and go to the garden. Yeah, so for 15, 20 minutes. So I'll let her back. Well, so what I want to, what was the topic?
We were talking about the speed or the relationship between immortality.
Yeah, precisely.
And
so that
or the failure of immortality.
the value is connected to the expectation of immortality, to the expectation of what it will value later. This kind of later, this kind of projection is, I think, very central for the concept of value in general. So if you expect the value to be lost in the future, it is somehow the object is devalued already now. And I think the second point is maybe connected to relational aesthetic and many other things like participatory art and so on. And so on. Is that people doing that somehow claiming, and that also returned in the 9th century for me, claiming that the actual artistic art is participation in this event.
Yeah.
So the process of, like you're saying, eating rice or
Mm-hmm.
That the participation in certain process is actual art.
Constitutes the
Yeah.
artwork, yeah.
And what is a documentation of that, like videos, photographs, descriptions, and that is simply documentation
Yeah.
and not actual art. That reminds me very much of a romantic discourse on art at the beginning of the 19th century, as people said that actually tempest on the sea
Yeah.
or visiting Swiss mountains
Mhm.
was actually experience of art.
Mm.
And paintings are completely accidental. You know, there are documents like now videos
Mhm.
or photographs. So romantic artwork is an event already.
Mhm.
Yeah? And the painting is only a document related to that,
Mhm.
but having no authentic value. For example, Kant speaks about that in the Critique of Judgment. You know, that artworks are not beautiful and not sublime. They are only relate to that.
Mhm.
Beautiful sublime is nature itself. So that is also kind of for me a kind of return to the 19th century aesthetics. This let's say loss of understanding that was very clear in the avant-garde, that not content an event but real material object is actually what's art all about. Okay? So the kind of shift back from the materialist ideology of the avant-garde, classical avant-garde, back to some kind of romantic myth of certain penetration of the mysteries of nature. But now it's a kind of mystics of the social. You know, as you said, instead of society, you have a mystic of the social.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
Instead of nature, you have a mystic of the natural experience.
Yeah.
That's the same.
Yeah. Yeah. In order to find out, I think it's true.
So maybe we could move on to in a sense, the current situation for a moment. I mean, think about 2001. Maybe does 2001 and the attack on the Twin Towers, which is seen in at least in American mythology now as a significant turning point. And the extent to which that is, I think we've in a sense have already answered this question.
I would say
It's more like a rhetorical question for you to say no, and then we can move on. And then is 2008, does that represent something, this credit crisis? Firstly, deal quickly with 2001, and then we can maybe move to 2008.
Yeah, well, 2001 we discussed, in fact, already. I mean, that was let's say so, the West didn't change, but the other did change.
Yeah.
The other of the West.
So it's significant.
And that repositioned the West. So the West maybe unconscious, remain unconscious and overlooked that, saying, okay, we were against fascism, we were against communism, now we are against political Islam.
Yeah.
So it overlooked the fundamental shift,
Yeah.
paradigm shift that was connected with that.
But
It's
because
not-
89 is
It's not the
also-
same paradigm.
No,
It's not
but
the same.
89 is also something that happens not to the West, but to its other. Yeah.
To its other,
But it's-
but in this terms
rather-
to the West itself,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it's a repositioned
Yeah.
West. Yeah, because you are always positioned always to the other. So if other disappears or changes, then you reposition. 2008, I think it's one next step
From 89 or from 2000?
from 89. And why? Because it's effect of 89.
Yeah.
The financial crisis effect of 89. Because during the Cold War, we had a kind of communist control against free markets ideology. It was understood in these terms. But of course, free markets in the West was a complete illusion, a lie, because everything was controlled by military, everything was controlled by political leadership, because Cold War situation overdetermined in economic logic. But at the moment Soviet Union was away, this lie becomes true. Suddenly, the West realized what was a pure ideology. And this, of course, collapsed. Yeah, I know. Always, if you realize your ideology is collapsed, yeah, ideology can be saved only if it remains ideology.
Yeah.
You really do out something, to realize it, it's over. So it's over. And it's over because it was realized at last.
Yeah.
And I think the next move will be really in the direction, as I see it now. I'm not a prophet, nobody is a prophet. But I think it would be a return to the roots, of European and Western culture, restoration, if you want, return to the roots, and kind of farewell to liberalism.
And a restoration of the 19th century world order, in a sense. But does that mean also a shrinking?
But without any communist liberal
exactly.
progressive
That's the most
perspective, so very radical. I think very radical.
Yeah.
Not this kind
Because
of
there's no softness.
No,
So
no, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And also experience of cruelty, of the 20th century cruelty.
Yeah.
I think it's also very important, because people became to be very cruel in the 20th century. I think psychologically this cruelty is in the psyche, very deep.
But how does that play out with globalization then? And we could also think about art in terms of the product of that globalization, of course, with the globalized art world after '89. That if the West does, or if the West, because in a sense it's an older West. Yeah, the West that we're talking about as the former West is finished, and that's this West of the avant-gardist, vanguardist, modernist West. There are the
It's finished.
Yeah, it finished. So this finished. So we're talking about restoration of another kind of West, which most people wouldn't have called the West in the period. That wouldn't have associated with Christianity, for instance, in the same sense that we all have to now. At that time, in the 19th century, as you said, the colonial wars, the relationship to globalization was one of domination. It wasn't, whereas the Western... Now, how does it play with globalization? How does is it a retreat of the West when it goes back to its roots to become more provincial and to allow the world outside of that Western paradigm to develop its own cultural and political systems? Or is it a return to a directly colonialist West that will seek to dominate the rest of the world? The globalization will be expressed again in terms of empire and not in terms of financial instruments of empire, if you like, but in terms of direct control of empire, direct governance of these other areas.
I think that simply, I think that the problem is that in the new world order, nobody knows its own borders.
Yeah.
So Russians don't know the borders of Russia. NATO don't know the borders of NATO. Chinese have no idea where China is, and so on. So and Islamists also don't know that. So nobody knows this area of influence and control. And I think that what the next period will be. People will be trying to define that.
Yeah.
Define the borders. I think they wouldn't dominate the world. Nobody would. Maybe America still, but even America maybe not.
Yeah.
I think the period of domination is over. Nobody's interested in that. Russia is not interested in that. China is not interested in that. USA is not interested in that. Everybody is interested.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure of Russia, for example, and China.
No, absolutely not. Because either Russia or China propose and want to propose, are interested in proposing any international ideology, any unified prospect. This whole dynamics of Russia in 10th century had to do with communism, and with promise of new world order and new mankind, which was also based very much on self-suppression and self-denial. So everything Russian was suppressed and forbidden to a much more degree than in other communist countries. You have, if you went, for example, from Russia to any other Baltic country, Georgia, they were much more open to the past as a Russia. Possible, almost completely erased. The word Russia itself was forbidden.
Yeah.
And it still is actually. So, to a certain degree. So Russia was in a situation of, had some universal claim. And contemporary Russia is far away from that and doesn't want that.
Mm-hmm.
People just want to be safe and sovereign in certain borders, and that's it. And know precisely what the borders are, because they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They want to find it out and regulate it.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same feeling it's many other places. People just want to define their borders and remain in it. But it takes some time to define them, to find them out, to understand what they really need, what they don't need. That takes some time.
And also the question of immigration, which has been the new forms of immigration which happened after '89 with this globalization. That's something which also confuses the question of borders. You often find in what we call the former West this discussion about question of loyalty and nationalism. Or for instance, the Moroccan politician who has 2 passports or whatever. This kind of question seems to be about that defining of borders. Which side are you on? And immigration is complicated. We haven't yet got a sense of how we define those people that are on both sides of the border. They're distrusted, like the Jews were in the 19th century.
Yes, of course, and that's why nationalism is also over.
Yeah.
And instead you have a system of religious communities.
Yeah.
For example, it's like Ottoman Empire, like also all the Russian Empire before communism.
Yeah.
Nationalism was forbidden.
Absolutely, of course.
So it was only a system of denomination, religious denomination. So that comes back here. If you have, for example, as Germans now began to deal with Muslim problems, it's never do that for decades. First thing they created was a Muslim religious committee that was responsible for them.
Yeah.
So, if you are secular Muslim, so to say, secular person with Muslim background, you have no chance in German society because you are not recognized in German, and at the same time you are
by neither side.
So you have to go to this religious institution because it's only one institution recognized by state. Same thing with Britain, as we know. And so it is religion and religious community that now defines your belonging to this social group. So we go back even to Middle Ages. And this go back to the Middle Ages is much more flexible system of nationalities.
Yeah,
Of course. We know, looking at National Socialism, we know very well how in which way it can work. So if you have a system of religious community, you have much more flexibility and possibility to go from one to another, to change them, to manipulate them, to find a flexible way among them, and so on and so on. So it's a pretty flexible system. And being more flexible, more appropriate to kind of age, I think it has much more chances that modernist notion of national art.
So then,
Or race.
absolutely. Then, in a sense, then an understanding of the systems of power as they work, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire might actually be a very, very useful moment to understand, because there are extraordinary paradoxes for us. For instance, the economic wealth was held by the Christian community, which was not the dominant religion. But yet, because that system, it was the system of tribute, and basically as long as you paid your taxes, then you could have as much money as you want, which would also appeal to current ideologies, actually. Also, in a strange way, that accommodated individualism, while of course locking you into being Jewish or Christian or Muslim as a defining, absolutely defining identity, because you didn't have any other identity. But it still had this flexibility, as you say, which nationalism doesn't have.
Absolutely, and it was Russian Empire was based on the same principle. And it's very interesting that new Russian state is going very fast in the same direction. They are also creates this religious institution, religious system of different kinds. So-called traditional religions, they have a lot of rights, and not traditional religions, but have not so much rights. And so there's a possibility of a state religion, for example. Some republics like Chechnya, Islam as state religion, or Tuva, the Buddhist religion, state religion. And that is all integrated by Kremlin. So everything is based also on religious allegiance. I think the return of this religious structure as a useful way to deal with this kind of globalization, I think it's also something that enhances a new medieval. Let's say new medieval.
This is what I wanted to say. If you see what's happening, we actually in the framework of formal West, we never discuss religion as such a key.
No.
Issue. But it absolutely, from this discussion, it's absolutely clear that it's a central issue, right? We identified a number of issues we need to look at, and that would be immigration, nationalism, global war, strategies of resistance, religion, one amongst them. But it's clear that religion stands somewhere above all these other issues and is definitional for them in some ways.
I think if you look back this time, you will see that that's paradigm change from the secularism to neo-religious.
That's what I wanted to ask a bit.
It's quite clear. It will be seen only like that.
But Boris, I'm not quite sure. Also, one of the first sentences in your medium religion booklet says, we experience something like return of religion, but it's not really return of religion, right? It's something that we tend to assume as a return of religion because of its presence in the media. We have this project now, Return of Religion and Other Myths, so we treat it as a myth that is both fictional and constitutive of our contemporaneity. And then the term post-secular comes in, right? What Jürgen Habermas launched not long ago, and ever since everybody struggles to define what this notion of post-secular is, because it's certainly not something that only comes after a secular era, but it's certainly not the religion. It's not. We're not in the midst of the theological discourse that would be thriving in the public sphere. It's rather that religion, as if hijacked key secular subjects, such as subjects of identity, for example. No,
No, I
it's
wouldn't
not
say-
really religion we're experiencing that return.
What, as my argument would be, it is religion.
Okay,
It's
so
not
it is,
faith, and it's not belief.
so it
So
is
it's
really religion.
It's really religion.
And you talk
Religion-
about set of opinions then?
No,
No,
no, it has nothing to do. Religion is not a belief.
and it's not a faith.
It's not a faith. A religion is a certain type of organization of society
Mhm.
and social practice.
Mhm.
And I think that what is returned. Not personal belief, not theology, not faith, nothing of that, nothing subjective, whatever. But after we lost secular modes of political social organization, we turn back to religious modes of this organization. So how we can organize communities, how we can organize this kind of not multicultural, but actually a trans-religious institution and trans-communal institution, and how we can how we can organize society based. And then we go to the concept of community, religious community, and religious allegiance, and then we ask the question how we can secure values, not only spiritual values, but also material values, how we can secure the art, who is responsible for museums, and so on and so on. And I think that in the near future, religion will be responsible for the museums, for the libraries, for all this stuff.
It's slightly worrying thought, or not?
For
we have
example,
shows of new Christian art.
it's interesting. I think that whatever you can say about Russia, Russia is very fast and was always experimental field for a lot of things, also like you say, because it's moving very fast. And so, for example, the Russian government is very, very fast. It's just very, they have no
No prohibition.
no prohibition. That fast. So, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of problems remained. Like, for example, who is making social security? Who was responsible for social program? Who is responsible for memory of victims of communist regime? Okay? So answer to all these questions is church.
Sure. Education?
Church. Church, no. Education, no.
No.
Education is separate. Even church participated. But social programs, humanitarian help, museums and centers dedicated to the victims of war, victims of repression styles, depression, and so on. So, it's everything church. So church takes all the social functions that new state doesn't want to have. After communist state's over, the communist state cared about that, but the new state doesn't want to do so. So who? Church. And so we have the same thing now, So if, for example, contemporary state is not very interested in humanitarian programs, then they are taken over by different churches and different religious organizations. But and also in Muslim world, Hamas and they are
United
raised
States.
like humanitarian organizations. So I think that we are in the process of restructuring our social life in a way that is very much like the century indeed, even medieval. where the church was fundamentally responsible for the aspects of life that the powers were not responsible for. They were responsible for maybe economy, war, things like that, security. But humanitarian needs of population were taken care of by the church.
Does this term post-secular play any role in your opinion? No, you
Not
don't seem to be
in mine.
busy.
Yeah, not in mine. Because you don't know what happens here. Secular is also not post.
Indeed, yeah.
I actually don't believe in all this post because we are still in the modernity, we are still in history, we are still thinking in terms of utopia and so on. So there, all these things are still there. I think we have only to ask the question what emerges as a dominant paradigm. Not as only one paradigm. If you say post-secular is just all secularism disappeared, but it didn't.
No, that's what's wrong.
And communists also didn't disappear, and utopianism didn't disappear, modernity didn't disappear. But it doesn't have same position in a general structure of society as before, and we have different forces and institutions that emerge as having dominant position. But if they emerge as having the dominant position, or that doesn't mean that other institutions would just disappear.
You know, the closest definition to simplify of this term post-secular would get to would be a current society that is increasingly becoming more religious, without becoming less secular.
Yes.
That's something which gave me enormous space, this idea that it's not really religion replacing secular society, but that there is more space for religion without losing space for secular.
No, not losing, but I mean, religious transformed itself in a way that it can react to the needs of the secular society.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's still a hegemonic struggle, isn't there, between those different religions and also the secular, the humanist, we could say, maybe better than the secular, the humanist faith system, you know, which is based on a faith in man rather than in God.
Human
somehow.
agency, there you go.
Yeah. And there's still, and I suppose one of the questions would be, can it be the Ottoman model, for instance, which was a model of relative coexistence, or is it to be a model of exclusiveness?
Return of religion and other myths. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, I think we need to think about whether this is because of what we're thinking about and what's current in the world. You know. But certainly, it's also what Boris has been working on a lot recently. It fits into the whole discourse in that sense.
So we can do it one more time and better.
Yeah, but I don't think it's because it's also about mapping. I think some of the interesting things we've had is the talk of which is maybe also related to religion, but not really to the loss of the avant-garde. Yeah, that's not a discussion of religion per se. It's about what the formerness of the former West is, which is in a sense, which is nice. The formerness of the former West is the absence of communism, or the promise of communism. That's what makes the West from the West that we understood to the former West, or maybe the old West. It's because you have this West, which is a West of the Holy Roman Empire or the Roman Empire, indeed, not the Empire of Constantinople, but the Empire of Rome, and that empire is the one that we're basically talking about, plus America, which is its child, plus Japan, which I still don't quite get. I don't know whether
to work that out. You know, why Japan is included, except the fact it's a conquered territory. You know, what is there a mindset in Japan which makes it available to? I don't know.
But do you refer to? He said there were actually 10 years that define that meant shift of a paradigm, which was 1909 till 1919, and ever since that was not really.
And then we had time to investigate
100 years to
what we did.
investigate it.
It's interesting, the oldest painting in the Van Abbe is a 1909 Picasso. Nice in that sense.
Okay.
You still have some time, you sure?
Yes, absolutely. It's okay.
Can I spend to the there we go. So, too much water.
Okay.
I know. Sorry.
Yeah, everybody has a right.
No, it's been
These
never
are
granted.
delicious wines.
Hmm?
These are delicious, whatever that is. Really nice.
Madame has a he has a somehow Italian food shop, you know.
Oh,
Now
but
she's
this
buying
is Japanese,
things there.
no? This is very Asian.
Yeah, but it is sold. It's there, but it's, I mean, it's Italian, but there's also possible things also French cheese.
I leave this one with you, huh? It's a little handbook, just a guide through the exhibition on the return of religion.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
It's incomparably smaller than yours. It's very tiny, actually,
Yeah.
which is a very tiny spaces.
Actually, I want to give you a couple of. It's a text about immortality, bodily
Oh, wow.
immortality. So for
Thank
you
you.
and Charles.
Okay. And when is the book coming from Medium Religion?
It's
Oh.
already made.
Yeah, that's what it is.
It's already made.
And Sloterdijk Road, I understood,
It's also like
on the return of religion.
I'm sure that the essay on. No?
It's still running now.
Yeah, okay. It's just for you, yeah.
Immortality. Essay on
Ah,
immortality.
Essay on immortality. Immortal Boris. It's the idea of resurrection.
Ah, yeah. Okay.
And just two questions I have, quick, practical. The lecture you gave in Amsterdam, they're going to publish in their own book. But Sven discussed with you that you would be willing to write another text for our reader, which is The Return of Religion and Other Myths.
He proposed that we make an interview,
Oh.
that you make the conversation with him. Because otherwise,
It's too much.
too much material that was already published,
Mm-hmm.
probably. So he wanted just to provoke me first.
Mm-hmm.
But if this conversation will be published, that is too much. I don't know.
No, it's never too much.
But this
Never too much for
conversation
us.
will be published definitely.
This one.
Yeah.
Well,
In one way or something.
yeah, that's something we need to determine, because we have some 3.5 years to do proper research. We would like to start with.
We should talk about that now. I think
Yeah.
we can kind of end the conversation.
Yeah, we end the conversation, yeah.
We start to build sort of digital archive where we speak with people like we speak with you now. We first of all want to make it available to a circle of people that are involved in the research of all of us. But we need to figure out a number of things. So as I said, we very much in the beginning of the whole process, somewhere in spring 2012, preferably in Germany, that's what we discussed, we'd like to have a major exhibition that would try to define former West. There are lots of questions we have such as also questions you posed, are there artists from the West only? Is the West the only subject, or do we really want to write history of the last 20 years where we involve other narratives to complicate it, complex? We, along the way, because we enjoy public funding, along the way we will have to have some kind of public activity, so we want to do a series of probably lectures and perhaps symposia. It still needs to be determined. But digital archive is one of those things we want to build. So we'd like to include this at some point into something that's publicly available. And we would like to publish a major reader that would identify key topics of the developments post-1989, next to a catalogue that would accompany the exhibition. So we envision now a two-part major publication that would be called Foreign West. So actually this interview would for us at this point function as a key orientation point for discussion, because I mean we talked for 2 hours, but you quite reoriented already the discussions we had. As I said, like, religion has never played such a prominent role, and it should have. So we'd like to stay in touch and see how we could perhaps really work for these 3.5 years, 4 years, 5 years, I don't know, together. And that would be a subject of discussions. Would you want to develop a separate research within the project? Would you want to work with us on a publication? Would you like to work with us on an exhibition? I mean, to figure out what the ideal role would be for you within our project, but also, of course, given what you're busy with the next 3, 4, 5 years, because you have big plans, of course, teaching and writing and publishing.
Well,
so it's
we
more
go back to
open.
that. Are we ready with the main discussion?
If we consider this the starting interview, then it can be continued at some point, yes.
Because I maybe, regarding to your last question, maybe I would give a certain additional answer to start your question. If you go back to the beginning of our conversation, you raised the problem of being in power, intellectual being in power, being in power. At the same time, the problem of critical intellectual is also
There
around.
you go,
And, well, speaking about religion, so if you look at the history of modernity, then we have this kind of critical intellectual being in power, and at the same time remaining critical. It's because we have in modernity this kind of utopia and this kind of ideology that was structured in a way that, I mean, now communist in the first place, that was structured in a way that you, at the same time, could manage the society in the name of it, but you could also criticize yourself in society in the name of it. So the same idea was
criticality.
critical and ideology of power at the same time. And I think what the structural problem with our time is that you have power on one side, the critical intellectual on the other side. That's why I speak about minority. That we don't have an ideology that would allow the critical intellectual to be in a position of power and remain critical at the same time. So in a very obvious way, a religious discourse allows that, because on the one hand, God is foundation of the authority, on the other hand, God is something staying outside of any authority, so that any authority can be criticized as being godless. So we have in classical religion tradition of the West, Christian religion, allows you to be in a situation of power and to criticize the power at the same time. So it gives you the same chance as the classical Marxism. I think it's a big plus.
And was arguably one of the main appeals of Christianity, and the reason for its success.
It's ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's a legitimation of power and delegitimation of power at the same time. And through the same movement. It's of course because on the one hand you are built on Christianity, on the other hand Christ is somebody who undermines every possible authority and is a paradigmatic victim. So in fact,
absolutely,
your play is the same movement as both sides of the divide.
And also this defining aspect of Catholicism, which is that the Christ figure is both absolutely human and absolutely divine. Which is where that paradox somehow comes together. Because Pelagianism, some of the heresies, wanted to declare him as divine and therefore remove him, or a non-religious structure would declare him as a prophet who was, like anybody else who had some good ideas, was just purely a human who died on the cross. But this ability, this doctrine, which was absolutely defended in the early years of the Church, of the Catholic Church, that he's both absolutely human, 100% human, and 100% divine, allows that appeal to the human side of him in terms of the exercise of power, and appeal to the divine side when you can criticize it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Of course, to nature. He posted this.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because that doesn't happen necessarily in religions which are not related to Judaism. So it happens in Islam, in those religions, but not in religions outside of that.
Maybe with the exception of Buddhism.
Buddhism, maybe
an exception.
But Buddhism is a withdrawal. Buddhism doesn't really deal with power that well.
No, it is draw and return.
It
returns from the withdrawal. But I think that what's central for our discussion here is how we can reconstitute the domination of intellectual in society. Because that is what our class interest is.
Exactly.
Our class interest.
Exactly.
That's
the only thing which we understand.
Our class interest, it comes back to the domination. And the question is, what is a religion a good way to do so? And I think a lot of things depends on the answer to this question.
So can you construct a religious avant-garde?
I think yes. And
I was Marxist. I think yes.
Yes, no question. Yes, the answer is yes. Actually, the Russians tried to do so at the beginning of such a, and at least influenced avant-garde and so on. And now it's a new wave, especially in Germany. Germany is not so obvious at other places, but here's extreme return and extreme interest in all kinds of sociological problematics everywhere. So you answer, and the level of German theology is very high. So because of this divide, because of this half Protestant, half Catholic, the country thought was always a problem and was a concern. So people are very aware of those problematics more than different other countries.
The Netherlands as well, but the Netherlands settled it in a different way.
And that's
through separation.
Separation.
And no engagement. And that's where the weakness of the intellectual discourse, which is there in the earlier period with Spinoza and Erasmus and things like that, kind of declines in the Netherlands when this separation happens, because then there's no force for change.
But here's a very strong, and very much growing also the structure of the politics. In the Ottoman Empire, anyway, in the Russian way, that's quite clear. And so it is obvious that there is some kind of class interest of German intellectuals
Yeah.
also involved. There are some invested interest of the intellectual class to find a way to return to the position of at least relative domination. I feel it very clear.
And I think
What's
it's
happening?
necessary. No? I mean, of course, for our own survival as a class, but also, for, you know, given that we're part of this class, we believe in its power of good. But I mean, another thing which we'll come back to, but I'm intrigued and really thinking about this thing that you said that the in the sense that art of the 90s, having lost this horizon, still has a desire, and desire probably is the right word in the consumer sense, but to do good, to be morally on the right side, and that's in a sense what saves it, because I think capitalism has no morality in that sense; it's amoral. It doesn't engage with it, and art retains this moral sense when there's no ideological framework in which it can put it. So what does it do with it? It's a lost morality. So
it's a humanitarian.
Yeah.
It's so to say.
Yeah, that's
At
true.
the moment, all these
Yeah.
humanistic aspirations collapsed. It's humanitarian rest. If you want to, you can save itself and the world, you at least do something good.
Yeah. You save the one child in Africa or the one in Gaza.
Or we will consume less energy.
And I think it also, and that's something that we have to address, I think it's also how, we might have to work this out, but how the question of ecology and sustainability plays into this, because that becomes, because that failed, in a sense, and still fails to generate a sufficient ideological mass to have real effect. Yeah, it's always just hovering on the edge, and never manages to take a centre stage somehow. It's not able to and it's partly to do maybe with not having a class interest as part of its basis. Yeah, it has no class that it represents. It represents the earth. Which is not very good. Nobody's really into that.
But the point is that how you can speak about energy in the terms with people if the energy should be saved.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Energy is not something that should be spent and spooled and so on, or something that should be kept and saved.
Yeah.
So it's the end of energy.
Yeah.
It's the end of Nietzsche. Absolutely. End of beliefs.
And it's also and also that beautiful quote in Bataille when he talks about economics, where the question is limited to how the excess is to be squandered.
Yeah.
And this is not only excess of money, but it's also excess of energy. Yeah? So if the green movement is trying to say no excess money, no excess energy, it's kind of it represents the earth, but it doesn't represent anything except the earth.
No.
And therefore, always we're going, yeah, it's very good, we should represent the earth, but it's not me. Yeah. and so so that's why it never. Maybe that's what I know. That's what deprives it of the critical mass to actually achieve power. I don't know, because it's not representative actually of anything other than this inanimate being, perhaps. That's a contradiction. Situation. But this being, if you like, without a democratic voice, which is the earth, which has no vote.
But they say you are part of it.
Yeah.
But people don't believe it.
No.
I think the problem is that there is a part of the earth and part of the universe and part of the nature, but people don't believe it because they say the nature doesn't love them.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, they know that if they died, Earth wouldn't be sorry. And so they are not sorry if Earth dies. There is something, certain kind of reciprocity. It can be one-sided love. Also, such things do not exist.
True.
No, that's it. So yeah, that's the big question. How do we survive as a class?
I think it's a central question.
First.
And I think we really have to care about
Yeah,
it. Because nobody else does. Okay, so...
Thank you very much.
Yeah, pleasure.
Maybe what Mario was saying, you go back to that about what you feel your involvement could be.
All possible things. I
Yeah,
don't
we
know
can
what-
take also time to discuss it.
Yeah, cool.
We don't need to conclude
No.
now. I hope, sorry to say that, but I hope you don't go to the States for 6 years.
But even when I go, it doesn't change anything because I will become...
No, but Europe needs you.
Huh?
Europe needs you.
I know that Europe needs you, but the problem is Europe will also pay me. That's
I cannot guarantee, sadly.
that's a big
It's like
question.
Earth.
But don't trust the Americans.
It's like also don't trust Americans. So I
You
will...
can trust the Europeans. It might be lower, but you know you get it every year.
Yeah, that's true. So I look at it in any case. But I don't know, I can produce something like this video, for example. I produce something for the exhibition. I can produce something like that.
Mhm. We're still not clear whether we want to do a series of publications, for
Yeah.
example, because that, could be part of it. We still need to, you see, that we need to go through so many conversations, also amongst ourselves, also with other people, because we...
So the question is with
Restrict it.
whom you will be cooperating, because, of course, for example, Canada would be interested to publish more from me.
Yeah.
Need to maybe speak
If
with
somebody would support.
But I
support
think
the
we want to
publication.
publish with you and MIT, right?
Yeah, we'd possibly do it after also.
After we'll be publishing with me.
So
that would be Roger anyway.
yeah, so that is easy in this case.
And he published Art Power?
He published
Art
Art Power.
Power published.
Published Art Power, and he published now a second book. So next year, also collection of texts like about Moscow conceptualizing.
Mhm.
So then one has to look at what happens after that. Of course, it would be interesting for me to write something here.
Mhm.
I appreciate that, because I accumulate a lot of text on religion and these topics, and yeah, that would be.
But maybe this defining of the end of the avant-garde and the question of what happens to the class that occupied this avant-garde position in the last 20 years, because that then is not. It takes the return of religious social structure as a background, but then kind of develops that for a condition that we have to deal with, rather than analysing and saying, do we have return of religion or not, which you've done very well recently. It's also saying, given the fact we have return of religion in this form, what does it mean for those horizons what does it mean for the communist promise, I think?
Well, I think that the one possibility to do with that is notion of sovereignty.
Right.
Mhm.
I will speak about power.
Yeah.
So, to what degree? Although one can describe avant-garde as an attempt to gain, as a gain to gain the sovereignty.
Mhm.
And sovereignty understood as something that is not only independence from, as people describe, but also domination as a public, domination of sovereign's capability to lead, to educate, to control. And I think that is the problem of sovereignty and the problem of how you achieve sovereignty, how you define sovereignty, how you match sovereignty. It was a very simple problem. And then, of course, the religion is a way to give a new dimension to sovereignty. Actually, it's not interesting. Maybe it would be interesting for you. Just an American context, I got a couple of weeks ago. I got a letter. It's a relatively large text by email from a guy who wrote me that he was very interested in superhuman figures in American comics, like Spider-Man and so on. And then he asked himself what is superhuman in general.